Martin Luther's break with the church at the Diet of Worms opened a Pandora's box of sorts, and other reform movements quickly emerged and spread. And so we have different expressions of some of the fundamental ideas of Protestantism that Luther had articulated, and these spread rapidly. Almost all of these movements emerged in the Holy Roman Empire, and this is a really kind of terrible map, but I wanted to point out to you guys on it. I chose this map because it had some city and state names that I wanted to show you guys. So here's Saxony. This is where Martin Luther lived and worked and started his Reformation. As kind of ground zero, if you will, of the Reformation. Up here is the city of Munster, which was entirely very important in the spread of Anabaptism. And down here we have the Swiss Confederation, which were not exactly entirely a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they kind of were. And in the Swiss Confederation is where Zwingliism takes root and dies out, and where Calvinism takes root in the city of Geneva, and it quickly spreads all over the place. And here's a very important area called the Palatinate, which will be absolutely essential to some of the later religious wars. And so the Holy Roman Empire was kind of the geographic center of the Protestant Reformation. One of the first movements to challenge Lutheranism, and I say challenge Lutheranism because it's a different idea about Protestantism that emerged in very rapid succession to Lutheranism, was Zwingliism, so called for its leader Ulrich Zwingli. This emerged in the Swiss Confederation and the Swiss cantons, and Zwingli, like Luther, was a Catholic priest. He was inspired by Luther and his ideas, and Zwingli sought to reform the church. And Zwingli actually came into conflict with Luther himself. He thought Luther didn't go far enough in his reform efforts and where he took his reform, both in terms of its theology and doctrine and its liturgy and practice. Zwingli was much supported by the princes of the Swiss cantons and the Swiss Confederation. And Martin Luther was really none too happy about his appearance. Just to give you guys an idea of how all of this was kind of separating. Okay, so in the Catholic Church, you have the doctrine that salvation is achieved by faith and good works. And remember, good works isn't like community service or acts of charity, even though it can certainly include those things. But this means the celebration of Mass, the reception of the sacraments, etc. And that religious authority, according to the Catholic Church, is contained in Scripture and tradition with a capital T. This means the collected teachings of the church through the magisterium over thousands of years, over the 2,000-year history of the church. And the fundamental way that Catholicism differs from Protestantism is on these two questions, okay? And Luther articulated these points first. And I would say I call these kind of like the twin pillars of Protestantism. They're the big main ideas that are accepted by all Protestants and something they all kind of have in common. And that's the idea of salvation being through faith alone, that man is saved by faith alone, that faith comes through grace, and salvation thus comes through grace, and works are not required. So justification by faith. And also the idea that religious authority is found only in Scripture. That is sola scriptura, what that means. Now, the Catholic Church celebrates 7 sacraments, and a sacrament, of course, is a visible sign of God's grace, as the Church teaches. One of the most important sacraments is the Eucharist, and the celebration and the reception of the Eucharist, which the Church teaches is the real body and blood of Christ in the bread and the wine. That's what transubstantiation means, that the body and blood, that the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Luther accepted two sacraments in his initial teachings on his movement, and those were baptism and the Lord's Supper. And the reason those two is he found direct links to them in Scripture. I might be mistaken, but I do believe Lutherans came to celebrate confirmation as well, even though I don't know if they give it sacramental bearing or standing. Now, Luther had very strong feelings about the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, as you can imagine, and he did not accept transubstantiation, that the bread and wine were changed fully in their substance into the body and blood of Christ, but that Christ was really present in them, a kind of consubstantiation. So they remained bread and wine, but we're going beyond some kind of symbol or memorial here for Luther, that there is a real presence of the body and blood of Christ. Zwingli also accepted the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, but in his teaching, the presence of Christ was symbolic, that the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist was to be celebrated more as a memorial, and it didn't have the real presence of Christ. In Catholicism, of course, there is ordained clergy, a very formal liturgy. The Catholics believe in the intercession of the saints, and thus you have the significance of relics and the viewing and veneration of relics as being having an intercessory model or component, and that statues, stained glass, crucifixes, and other images can be effectively used in the worship process and the bringing of the person to God. Martin Luther retains an ordained clergy, although he de-emphasized the role of the clergy in bringing an individual to salvation or to heaven. Because salvation comes through faith, and since we don't need good works, namely the sacraments or the attendance of Mass, then the clergy becomes less significant in that very, very important role of bringing the individual to salvation. Lutheran liturgies were much more scripturally focused, even though they did continue to have the celebration of the Lord's Supper. He emphasized the reading of Scripture, prayer, and the singing of hymns. They did retain the saints, but the saints as examples, and de-emphasize this intercessory nature of the saints. And he did continue to emphasize that things like stained glass and statues could be helpful in the worship experience, even though to a lesser degree than they were emphasized by Catholicism. Now, here is really, here's the two places in the sacraments and in this kind of stuff in dealing with clericalism and liturgy, where Zwingli and then other reformers significantly differed from Luther, and they thought he didn't go far enough. Zwingli didn't retain an ordained clergy, even de-emphasize that. Of course, you would have a person to lead prayer, to lead worship, but this was more individualized. It was more personal. He emphasized family worship. For example, there was a much greater emphasis on scripture and prayer within the Zwingli liturgy, so emphasizing the reading of scriptures, the preaching, etc., and much more heavily simplified than Luther was an advocate of. So no images, no statues, no stained glass, etc. That these things were idolatrous and they were distracting from the ability of the person to pray to God. Now, the princes and those who supported Zwingli and the nobles and princes who supported Luther wanted them to unify their movements. They wanted to protect this new Reformed church. And something that I want to point out here is that both Luther and Zwingli relied heavily upon the protection and the supports of the nobles and princes. They saw these political authorities as being A, a source of the protection of themselves and their movements, and B, the best way to spread their reform movements. And so they emphasized in their church as the church being subject to the authority of the states. And that's really, really important and is really significant. And so these princes, these noblemen, they were like, hey, you two don't need to fight against each other. And the reason that you don't need to fight against each other is because you have a much bigger problem with the Catholic Church itself. Like, you've got a big adversary in the Catholic Church to confront, and we have to deal with the emperor, who was staunchly Catholic and really had no patience for these reform movements that were kind of starting up in his territory. And they said, look, y'all's best way to survive and to promote your movements and to bring real reform to Christianity is to unite your efforts. Don't work against each other, work together. And so under the encouragement and because of the encouragement of their nobles and princes, Luther and Zwingli got together at the German city of Marburg for an event that came to be known as the Marburg Colloquy. And here in this painting commemorating this event, we can see them kind of arguing with each other. They came to a common understanding of most things and were willing to find common ground on most things. But the whole effort fell apart over really the question of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which Zwingli insisted was symbolic and Luther insisted was real. The whole affair broke down over this question, and is really kind of central to their understanding of the doctrine here. So you can see both men really being kind of morally strong and refusing to cave on this important question. But the whole thing broke down and the movements did not unify. Martin Luther did not like Ulrich Zwingli, not at all. He really despised him for challenging his movement, for challenging his interpretation of Christianity, and he refused to shake the man's hand when they departed. Shortly following the Marburg Colloquy, Zwingli died. I wonder if y'all have been sitting here wondering, well, geez, do I know? Like, I know somebody who's Lutheran, but do I know anybody who's a Zwingli or a Zwingliite? And you don't. Civil War type skirmishes emerged between Catholics and followers of Zwingli in the Swiss cantons in a series of wars down there. And during one of these, Zwingli was killed and his movement died with him. As the ultimate sign of disrespect, Catholic soldiers mutilated Zwingli's body. They cut him apart, and they went as far as to cut his testicles off and shove them in his mouth. Upon hearing what had happened to Zwingli, Martin Luther is reported to have remarked that Ulrich Zwingli got what he deserved. Calvinism became the most successful and widespread of the Protestant movements of this era, of the Reformation era. Calvinism is so called for its founder, John Calvin, who in 1541 wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, in which he laid out his kind of a religious and theological and moral understanding. Historians call him a second-generation reformer because even though he's only about 20 years after Luther, the Institutes of the Christian Religion was published in 1541, he had been a young man at the time, at the start of the Protestant Reformation, and had really been formed by Protestant teaching in his education and youth. John Calvin was French, but ended up settling and founding his societies and religion in the Swiss territories in the Swiss Confederation, because the French, being strongly Catholic, were rather intolerant of his ideas. And so Calvinism first emerged in the Swiss city of Geneva. Calvinism, of course, ascribes to the twin pillars of the Protestant faith, that the salvation is achieved through faith alone, and that religious authority is found only in Scripture. Is very different from other forms of Protestantism, however, in its belief in predestination. John Calvin stressed what he called the sovereignty of God, that God was omniscient and omnipotent. So he's omniscient. God is everywhere. God is sovereign, and God is omnipotent. He is all powerful. Okay, all powerful. And this all-knowing, all-powerful, sovereign God has determined from the dawn of time the fate of every soul, whether that person will be saved or condemned. And so this is what predestination means. Okay, so our salvation, the salvation of man, is not in the hands of the individual. It is in the hands of God, and it has been predetermined by him. Now, he also taught something called the perseverance of the saints. So even if you had somebody who was a little rascally and squirrely and sinful in their life, that if they were predetermined by God to be saved, then they would right themselves. They would right their life. He believed in a form of theocracy in which church leaders governed the civil society, but this didn't happen for Calvin at the state level. It happened at the town level or at the city level. So in Geneva, in Calvin's Geneva, the church leaders ran the city. They didn't run the whole state. They didn't run the whole territory, but they ran the city. And all the citizens of Geneva then were not only subject to civil law, but they were subject to the ecclesiastical law. They were subject to the law of the church. So he's a little bit different. Well, he's not a little bit. So he's a lot different from Luther and Zwingli, who said that the church was subject to the political authority and wanted to use the political authority for the protection of the church and the spread of their religious ideas. Calvin goes the other way, and he says that the local town, the city, the civil authority in that local area is subject to the authority of the church leaders. Calvinism stressed a very strict morality and a very strict modesty. So good, wholesome, clean living. Calvin and his church leaders frowned upon the consumption of alcohol, the practice of prostitution, even dancing and the playing of cards, which they saw as sinful and frivolous. Modesty, not only in dress, Calvinists dressed very modestly, didn't wear bright colors or fancy clothes. They lived modestly. Even the prosperous among them didn't keep servants and others in their homes. You didn't do anything flashy or own anything flashy. You didn't try to call attention to yourself. Everybody worked hard, and they even many Calvinist communities banned the celebration of Christmas as being too frivolous and pagan in its nature and origin. And they really emphasized hard work. If you've ever heard the expression that idle hands are the devil's playthings, that is John Calvin. And so Calvinism became very appealing and very popular because noblemen and others would travel to Geneva, and they would be like, wow, here's this whole town of people where everybody behaves and everybody's kind of modest and working hard, and they're prosperous. They came to associate, the Calvinists did, prosperity with being an outward kind of sign of salvation. And so a lot of influential people, especially in the European nobility, really kind of liked Calvinism. They thought that this was not such a bad way to go. Calvinism, however, never gained a majority status anywhere in Europe. It was plentiful, it was very widespread, but never, Calvinism was never a majority. If you can see in this map what we have here, okay, the Calvinists are the purple, and we'll actually look at this map a little bit later in class and talk about some other things, but you know, you've got Calvinists everywhere. Look, we've got Calvinists everywhere, okay, but Calvinists were almost never a majority, and because of that, they really relied upon, in a political stance, they needed the state and the political authorities to protect them or leave them alone, and they were quite hostile when the political authorities of the state didn't do that. The Calvinists were militant, they were zealous in their own defense, and they were also militant in spreading their religion, kind of very zealous missionary focused religious expression. And so, as we shall see, because of this kind of militancy, it's the Catholics and the Calvinists who are very often at war with each other during the European religious wars, even though that's not always exclusively the case. Now, you can see on this map, there's another little group called the Anabaptists. Oh my goodness, and look how little and tiny they are right here. But they were influential. The Anabaptists were really kind of a marginal or sort of extreme, if you will, expression of Protestant theology. And the Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists of this era really couldn't agree on much, but one thing that they did agree on was that they all thought the Anabaptists were weird and dangerous, and thus the Anabaptists were heavily persecuted everywhere that they existed. And you can see their numbers were really quite small. The Anabaptists believed in a more literal interpretation of Scripture, and they equated spiritual equality, which was something that goes all the way back to Luther. You don't need a priest to get to heaven. You just need to have faith, with social equality, which is not something that Luther or Zwingli or Calvin or any of those guys advocated or talked about. Okay, but the Anabaptists saw the spiritual equality of Christians to mean that all people were socially equal as well. Now, this is why the Anabaptists were perceived as dangerous. This was just a little bit too much for people at the time. The Anabaptists even allowed women to preach and to teach and to hold positions of power in their community. So, of course, everyone else thought that that was incredibly strange. The Anabaptists differed most from the other Christian movements in their belief in adult baptism. They did not baptize their infants. Now, one of the areas in which, as you can see, all of Catholics and Protestants agreed on was baptism and the need of baptism for salvation, that you had to be baptized, you had to belong to Christ. And so they all baptized their infants, not the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists, and this is part of their spiritual equality, social equality beliefs, believed that you had to come to Christianity willingly and knowingly. And so thus, to truly be a Christian, you could only be initiated into that as an adult. You had to consent to it, if you will. They also taught that they were not bound by the laws of the state, only the laws of God. Now, this did not help their cause with anybody. Of course, they were never a majority. Very often, the Anabaptists were marginal communities. They were marginalized, and their unwillingness to follow the laws of the state most often emerged in their unwillingness to provide military service to the king or the prince or the nobleman. And this is just one of the many reasons that they were really perceived of as dangerous by political authorities, whether those political authorities were Catholic, Calvinist, or Lutheran. John Leiden was perhaps one of the most prominent leaders of the Anabaptists, and he was able to found a city well, he didn't found this city, but the city of Munster. He made this an Anabaptist city, and he was kind of the leader of the city, if you will. And the city of Munster in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire became the only city, I guess, to ever be controlled for any period of time by the Anabaptists. And John Leiden preached that Christ would come very soon and the Anabaptists were going to be saved. They were preparing for the coming of Christ, for the Armageddon, etc., if you will. And great tragedy befell them at Munster. Okay. So the city of Munster, if you think back to the map we went over a bit ago, was in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. And eventually, because all the nobles and political authorities of the time period found them to be dangerous, found the Anabaptists and their ideas to be dangerous, not just strange, but a danger to their existence in civil society, a joint army of Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist forces assaulted the city of Munster, and they took the city of Munster by force. The Anabaptists defended themselves zealously and kind of to their greatest ability, but to no avail. John Leiden and his colleagues were captured, and a great deal of people were killed. and the Anabaptists were kind of forced into a life on the outskirts of society as they continued to exist. You can see here's a drawing of Leiden and others being burned at the stake. They were shown no mercy, if you will. So after Martin Luther broke with the Catholic Church at the Diet of Worms and lived to tell the tale and to start his movement, other Protestant movements emerged in quick succession, and Christianity was very much divided.